He embraced what he called a do-or-die strategy, but now UK leader Boris Johnson faces double defeat as Parliament rejects his plans for Brexit and a snap election. Will he hang on to fight another day? And what now for Britain's plan to leave the EU? This is Inside Story. Hello, I am Hashem Ahelbarra. Welcome to the programme. More than 3 years ago, a majority of voters in the UK said they wanted to leave the EU. But what followed has been a lot less clear. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson failed to break the latest deadlock over Brexit. On Wednesday, MPs voted down his attempts to trigger a snap election. They also passed a bill blocking the possibility of a no-deal exit from the EU. Johnson had said he was willing to consider that if no new withdrawal deal was agreed. So where does that leave the Brexit process? There's a lot to cover with our guests, but first, this report from Andrew Simmons in London.
Another defeat for Boris Johnson, already on the back foot with a rebellion in his party and the opposition taking over the parliamentary timetable.
The ayes to the right, 327. The noes to the left, 299.
Within minutes, Boris Johnson was on his feet with his plan for a snap election.
I don't want an election. The public don't want an election. The country doesn't want an election. But this House has left no other option than letting the public decide who they want as Prime Minister, and I commend this motion to the House.
Under the opposition bill that now has to be passed by Parliament's upper house, Johnson is forced to seek an extension of the Brexit deadline. That would move it to January, scuppering his do-or-die plan for a no-deal Brexit, if necessary, on October the 31st. But Labour, the main opposition party, isn't ready to give support to Johnson's call for an election which needs a two-thirds majority.
The offer of the election today is a bit like the offer of an apple to Snow White and the Wicked Queen, because what he's offering is not an apple or even an election, but the poison of a no deal. So, Mr. Speaker, I repeat what I said last night. Let this bill pass and gain royal assent, then we will back an election so we do not crash out with a no-deal exit from the European Union.
Unsurprisingly, with Labour abstaining, Johnson's attempt to get an immediate election didn't pass.
So the ayes have it that the House will be aware that the motion has not obtained the majority required under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act.
This is about defending our democracy.
Ahead of the latest political drama, demonstrators in Parliament Square denounced Boris Johnson's actions, accusing him of engineering a no-deal Brexit by claiming there are still chances of a deal when there's no progress whatsoever. Boris Johnson may have only been in power for 6 weeks, but he doesn't have control right now. Nevertheless, you've only got to listen to the demonstrators here to realise the central issue is about trust. And the opposition want to be absolutely sure there's a copper-bottom guarantee he can't play any tricks if there is an election. The second largest opposition party is also against an immediate election.
People don't trust Boris Johnson when he says he really wants a deal. We all suspect that he wants a no deal. And we also want to make sure that he's not able to use his prerogative powers as the Prime Minister to create some tricks and allow the country to crash out.
Another day of unprecedented moves within Parliament, and with it still uncertainty about what the people of the United Kingdom might expect from its political leadership. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera, Westminster.
Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Alex Deane, Managing Director and Head of Public Affairs UK at FTI Consulting and former Chief of Staff to David Cameron. From Brussels, Larissa Brunner, Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. And again, from London, Bennett, Brexit commissioning editor at the Telegraph. Welcome to you all to the programme. Alex, Boris Johnson was widely seen as someone who could accomplish what eluded his predecessor, Theresa May. But after the series of setbacks he's suffered over the last few days, what are the options left for him?
Well, plainly, this is suboptimal. It's not what Boris wanted to happen by any means. You are right. But he can still seek either to force an election, and there's no reason he can't bring a bill for a general election back, either under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, seeking the two-thirds majority he didn't get last time, or he could pass a one-line bill saying, notwithstanding the provisions of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, let's have an election anyway. And on that sort of vote, you'd only require a majority of one. Recent events in Parliament have shown he may not get that too. But let me make the point, there is an ultimate irony that will be apparent to many of your viewers, who, if they know Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of our opposition party, for one thing, it's that for the last 2 years he's been calling for an election. And now finally, when the government offers him one, he says no.
Larissa, when the EU sees the UK entering into this sort of uncharted political territory, what is the general sentiment among the key players of the EU?
I think the general sentiment among the key players in the EU at the moment is dismay and probably also a little bit of frustration. Dismay because because it is clear that the UK Parliament knows what it doesn't want. It doesn't want a no-deal Brexit, but it is a lot less clear what it wants instead, and whether it can find a positive solution to the Brexit outcome, and whether an orderly withdrawal can be ensured. And I think there's also a bit of frustration at the way that the UK is using the current extension of Article 2 October 31st, because after the UK was offered this extension, basically the hope of EU leaders was that the UK would use this extension wisely to come to some sort of positive conclusion, but instead it looks, I think, from the EU's perspective, like basically this time is largely wasted on power games.
Asa, is it fair to say at this particular moment that garnering the support of a two-thirds majority is a turned chapter for Mr. Johnson?
Well, clearly we saw this week that Labour does not want to give enough support to provide that two-thirds target, provide enough numbers for it to be hit. And why is that? Simply because Jeremy Corbyn now wants to ensure that this no-deal law passes into the House of Lords, and it's very much on the UK's statute books. And this is because, in effect, he is realising that he's finding it all too hard to resist the temptation to play with the Conservatives, like a cat might play with a dead mouse, swatting it around. And to what end, though? Because as Alex is saying, yes, that Jeremy Corbyn, as the man who's meant to be the country's alternative Prime Minister, has been begging, asking for an election. And clearly he's just paranoid that Boris Johnson will turn around on winning Labour's approval and say, very good, thank you for approving this. We're now going to pick an election day for after October 31st. Oh, what's that? No deal Brexit by default? Instantly, Brexit's in the bag. So it's a level of distrust, clearly, from the Labour side, which is regrettable.
Alex, when you see the statements...
I would add what...
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I was simply going to say there is one other possibility. I don't disagree with Asa at all, of course, that he's right. That's the explanation Labour has given for not wanting an election. There might be one more found in opinion polling, which suggests that the Conservative Party is now some 10 points ahead. It may be that Jeremy Corbyn, having screamed for an election for over 2 years, now facing the realistic prospect of having one, realises he might lose it and therefore doesn't want to have it. I hate to sound venal, but that might be the more realistic explanation.
Alex, it could be also that Corbyn is trying to be also as opportunistic as Mr. Johnson. He knows that going to the polls 2 weeks before the deadline, the EU deadline, could give Johnson some leverage, but that if they could further freeze it, he won't have that leverage. And the general sentiment among the people in the UK would further change after the 31st of October. That could deny him a comfortable lead in the election.
I think that's fair. And one thing we haven't mentioned is that perhaps the most vibrant force in British politics right now that has really changed things, like them or not, is the Brexit Party, with some 20+% support in the polls for a general election. Right now, Boris would think to himself, if we have an election, my position on Brexit is very clear. I will get most of the support of people who are currently inclined otherwise to vote for the Brexit Party. But if we fail once again on the third time to leave the EU after a stated date that has been given by our Prime Minister, then perhaps support for the Brexit Party not only returns to that 20%, but soars beyond it. That's got to be the fear for the Conservative Party right now.
Larissa, as the situation is fast-moving in the UK, it's most likely we're going to see an extension of the EU deadline. Do you think that the Europeans will be receptive to any demands by the British government over the coming days?
Well, of course, it's not a foregone conclusion because basically you would need unanimous approval in the European Council to get an extension. So even a single country could veto it. However, I do think that this is quite unlikely for two reasons. First, because I think EU leaders do not want to be seen as being the ones that triggered a no-deal Brexit. That would have very severe consequences, both politically and economically, for many member states, especially Ireland. And second, it looks like a general election is inevitable sooner or later. I think the only question is when it takes place. And I think that might be another reason for the EU to grant the UK an extension, because a general election brings with it the possibility of political change. And even if the Conservatives are leading at the polls in the polls at the moment, there is still the possibility that a general election will change the composition of parliament and therefore make an orderly withdrawal more likely. Mm-hmm. And I think for those two reasons, the EU, I think, would be quite unlikely to refuse an extension.
Asa, quite interesting the tactics played by both key parties in the UK. Now, the Labour seem to be now willing, first of all, to aim for the top priority, which is to freeze any attempt by Johnson to go for a deal, for a Brexit with or without a deal. And then they are willing to negotiate another agreement about the election. Why is the Labour walking down that particular path?
I think because they fear that if you have an eve of October 31st Brexit election, that Boris Johnson would be able to build unstoppable momentum because he could pose as Mr. Brexit, the man who brought everyone Brexit at the helm of the vote leave referendum bus. And he could appeal, as Alex has brought up, to Tory voters, Tory leavers especially, Brexit Party voters, and also try and keep Tory Remainers who are less keen on Brexit on board by saying, if you don't vote for me, you have that crypto-Marxist Jeremy Corbyn walking into Downing Street, who, by the way, let's remember, is so unpopular in Parliament that the rival parties could not agree on him as an alternative Prime Minister. He is so unpopular among the general public that a recent poll found that actually more people prefer the Liberal Democrat leader Joe Swinson as an alternative Prime Minister to Jeremy Corbyn. And incidentally, the actual Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is leagues ahead of both of them at 45% compared to about 20%. And so given this, then Boris Johnson would have a very compelling campaign to fight if he was doing on the eve of Brexit. In the meantime, of course, if Labour managed to delay Brexit, string it out, perhaps get this law passed and then sit there making sure that no election's approved yet, they could run down the clock, wait till middle of October, see Boris Johnson shout and scream as he tries to do everything he can, maybe even resign, but maybe not, to avoid having to ask to delay Brexit. And at that point, his singular aim on October 31st would have been shattered. It would be an uphill struggle as an election campaign to fight at that point, a late Brexit November election. So it would be very much Labour's to win at that point.
Alex, but don't you see that Mr. Johnson, by his move, is further undermining the Conservative Party? Look at the statements made yesterday, the reactions from Philip Hammond, Ken Clarke, the rebels. You get an impression that the Conservative Party is about to crumble.
No, I don't have that sense, actually. Of course, the people you are naming are no longer Conservative MPs. They're still in the House, but they don't take what we call the whip. They don't take the discipline of the Conservative Party anymore, and they are therefore unable to stand as members of Parliament for the Conservative Party again. They will be able to stand, of course, for any other party or indeed as independents, but just not for the party that got them elected last time. This strengthens Boris Johnson's hand in any potential election, because in their seats, which are overwhelmingly very safe Conservative seats, there will be new Conservative candidates chosen, and those candidates will be far more likely to support Boris Johnson than those who've already demonstrated that they absolutely won't. That is to say, they didn't just vote against their Tory policy, they voted for a government to be denied the levers of power, for the control of the House of Commons to be passed instead to the opposition on the explicit basis that they would then give that power to the European Union, either for an extension, or if we can't agree an extension, take whatever extension the EU gives us. This is the worst possible signal for Parliament to have sent to the EU. Why would the EU negotiate with us in any meaningful way if they know that we're just going to have extension after extension and effectively stay in? So no, I think it strengthens Boris's hand to have new MPs in those seats.
Larissa, why is the EU saying that it will not bend on any of the demands made by Johnson, and that the offer that was given to Theresa May still stands on the table, and that could be the best way out to an orderly exit from the EU?
Well, the main point of contention is the backstop for the Irish border, and the sort of the problem for the EU is really that the sort of concessions that Brexiteers want, and they include time limiting the backstop, or alternatively allowing the UK to withdraw from it unilaterally. The problem is that from the EU's perspective, giving into those concessions would basically undermine the basic functioning of the backstop, because an insurance policy that is time limited is not an insurance policy from the EU's perspective. And that's why it simply cannot give in to those demands. What the EU, I think, could do and is willing to do would be to consider alternative arrangements to the backstop if they are viable and if they fulfill the same objectives as the backstop. And the problem is that it doesn't really look like any alternative arrangements have been found and can be found. So that fundamentally is the problem. And when we consider the backstop issue, it's not just about the border, well, having a border or no border on the island of Ireland. It's really it really touches very, very fundamental issues of the EU, like solidarity, for example. And because it's really about the question whether EU member states support a small member state if its vital interests are threatened against the economic interests of a soon-to-be third country. And if you suddenly phrase it in those terms, then it becomes an entirely different issue. And it, I think, becomes and even other member states, I think, can then see a bit more easily why it's so important that they stand behind Ireland, because they might need EU solidarity at some point in the future too, and they wouldn't want the member states to abandon them. So I think that's really why the EU can't give in to the Brexiteers' demand on the backstop.
It was quite interesting when Boris Johnson was basically saying that he would use his negotiating skills to be able to change the EU's position when it comes to the Northern Ireland border. Do you think that the backstop alternative is something still possible against the backdrop of the drama that is unfolding in the UK?
Oh, it's still possible, but obviously the EU has to genuinely believe it is deliverable in Westminster, the changes that then Boris Johnson would seek, because really what's governing all this is the parliamentary arithmetic in the House of Commons, in that, just go back to Theresa May for a second, when she tried to get a deal and change the backstop and everything around it, about, 3 times now, she had a deal rejected. And so EU leaders tried every time to change it just enough and had it rejected again. And now we see that clearly Boris Johnson is struggling to get anything through Parliament, and MPs are running rampant, able to tie his hands on no deal. And so it's no wonder EU leaders aren't really taking negotiations seriously, because then they think nothing would pass this Parliament, especially when some Eurosceptics say in the same breath that even if the backstop was taken out, they would still want more.
Alex, you seem to to be saying basically that you don't think that this is something which is going to further undermine Boris Johnson. On the contrary, this is something which is going to consolidate his power base. Here is the gobble, though. If he decides to go, or if we have an election, he will definitely have to be very aggressive to be able to bite into the power base of the Brexit Party. But by doing that, don't you think that he could just further undermine the Remainer within the Conservative Party itself?
Yeah, there is a balance to be struck, you're right. But I think Boris has already done enough to draw away much of the strength of the Brexit Party's electoral appeal, at least in the present time before the 31st of October. He's demonstrated that he's serious about Brexit and doesn't want to take no deal off the table. I really see British politics as like this. The divide on the, broadly speaking, right between the Tory party and the Brexit Party is a smaller one. That is to say, the Tory party's done well to take much more of that vote in the current environment than the divide on the left between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, where whatever you think of them, the Lib Dems have a crystal clear position on Brexit. They don't want it. And the Labour Party has been to and fro on what they think about Brexit and where they are on our membership of the European Union. So in that circumstance, I think that Boris does very well at an election with a more broadly unified right and a more generally divided left. And that's why he feels so positive about the prospect of an election.
Larissa, what kind of impact is this political drama now in the UK having on the EU leadership? Because sometimes you get the impression they're trying to stay away and comment only when it's suddenly about one of the key contentious issues between the UK and the EU.
Yeah, I mean, the EU has really tried to stay out of the whole UK domestic political drama, basically even since before the referendum. It didn't get too involved in the referendum campaign, and even in the past 3 years, it has really tried to stay out. I'm not sure that the current political drama really has too big of an effect on the EU leaders, because basically, I think for EU leaders, the main question is, can there be an orderly withdrawal of the UK? And if so, when can it be? And all this drama at the moment, we're not really getting closer to a resolution of the fundamental question around Brexit. Is there going to be a deal, no deal, or is Article 50 going to be revoked? Mm-hmm. And that is the fundamental decision that needs to be made. And at the moment, all this political drama, I think, is it's basically just kicking the can further down the road.
Asa, I think one of the things that many people would agree about when it comes to the UK at this particular moment is there's absolutely no clarity about the future. I'll just give you an example. The Lib Dem, for example, are for anything that would stop the Brexit. The SNP would say that this is going to further give Scotland the right to go for an independence. The Labour, we know that they are dithering when it comes to how to move forward. And the Conservatives seem to be divided than ever. Is Britain suddenly, or is it because of the 2016 choice, entering an unprecedented political stage?
Well, look, the reason why it seems that our political class are being so inept about this is because the government doesn't have the numbers to get anything through this parliament. And at the same time, you have an opposition in the Labour Party who seem to be increasingly pandering to Remainers, never really accepting a deal, and some Labour MPs, for example, a good few dozen, who rejected the original deal several times and are now turning around, having found that the alternatives that await them are an even worse sort of Brexit, of a no-deal Brexit, or just trying again, maybe selling out their voters, or who actually voted leave. Meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats, then, you know, at least they have some sincerity of just hating Brexit, never liking it, in the same way the SNP do as well. And so, you know, they can't really seem to decide whatever they want at all. Even with the general election, you have Jeremy Corbyn in one breath saying our Prime Minister is a dictator, and that his followers feel that a coup has taken place, thanks to Boris Johnson. But no, they don't want to go back to the people just yet, because that's improper. Other things have to happen. So it's no wonder then Boris Johnson is so desperate and keen for a new parliament.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It will be really interesting to see how and whether Mr. Johnson will be able to deliver on his promise to crash out of the EU with or without a deal. Alex, Deane, Larissa, Brunner, Asa, Bennett, thank you very much indeed for your contribution to the programme. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.